Summer can be a bit of a slog. For us, it's often for some reason a rather busy time, and I'm sure we're not alone.
Well, you can beat the summertime sadness and the August angst and enhance your everyday with our excellent sponsor, Via Hemp. This is a company that crafts award-winning premium THC and THC-free gummies.
Each of these gummies is especially designed to cultivate a specific mood. Whether you're looking to get relaxed, get quality sleep, get creative, or just to get focused. If you're 21 or older, you can experience it for yourself and get 15% off your first order with our exclusive code MSheet at viahemp.com. That's VIIAHEMP.com.
I personally enjoyed their grapefruit flow state gummies. This CBG and CBD powerhouse really helped me tap into my productivity. Like, we have had an extremely busy summer, and I feel flow state got me over the finish line a few times when I was editing multiple episodes a day, digging through documents, and knocking out a bunch of interviews.
Via Hemp does not require a medical card, and it ships legally to all 50 states. It's also affordable, and even more so for Murder Sheet listeners who get a special deal.
If you're 21 and older, head to viahemp.com and use code MSheet to receive 15% off. That's VIIAHEMP.com and use code MSheet at checkout. After you purchase, they ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. Enhance your everyday with Via.
This episode is sponsored by AutoTrader. Credit scores, down payments, interest rates. Car buying can be a numbers game, but you don't have to be a math expert to get the keys to your dream car. Just use Kelley Blue Book My Wallet on AutoTrader. Crunch your numbers and get your personalized results so you know exactly how much you'll pay each month for your car. It's like having a magic wand for your wallet. Presto! The car you've been wanting is now within reach. So hit the road and leave your calculator at home. Find your next car on autotrader.com.
Content warning. This episode includes discussion of murder.
Today on the cheat sheet, we're going to be talking about 5 different cases from Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, New York, and Kentucky. These are going to range from a recent cold case solve in Florida to a even more recent killing in upstate New York. And we're going to get all into that now. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases. We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is The Cheat Sheet, Canes and Chloroform.
So let's start in Pennsylvania. Our sources for this were NBC Philadelphia and also 6ABC. From those sources, I'm sure you figured out this is a case that happened near the Philadelphia area, actually in a suburb of Philadelphia in Montgomery County. It involves a woman named Renee DiPietro. This is a 70-year-old woman who was convicted of third-degree murder. And so that raises an obvious question is, what is third-degree murder?
Yeah, I'd be very curious. You hear about second degree and first degree. You don't really hear as often about third degree.
And there's a reason for that. One is that in the United States, what do you want to just guess? How many states do you think even have third-degree murder on the book?
I'll go with a number that is associated with this and say 3 because it's third.
Absolutely correct.
Oh, man.
Anya Kane, brilliant as always. 3 states, Pennsylvania,
Okay.
Minnesota, and Florida.
Oh, wow. Okay. So not too common.
And basically, a third-degree murder is when you kill someone and you don't necessarily have the intent to do it, and it doesn't take place during the commission of a felony.
Okay. What about manslaughter?
Different states call things different names.
All right. So, yeah, definitionally.
So maybe in another state, some of these things could be considered manslaughter.
Okay. That makes sense. We all have different laws in the United States. It's not uniform, but sometimes things can function similarly.
So Miss DiPietro, this is a 70-year-old woman. She somehow hears from her son that her son is having some sort of a situation at a bar where he's gotten into a confrontation with someone where punches of some kind were thrown.
Okay, so like a bar fight.
Yeah. And basically, Mom, come help. So this man's mother, the 70-year-old woman, comes to the bar to get her son. And she comes prepared. She comes with a 16-inch knife, which is hidden in her cane.
Jeez.
So that sounds to me almost like something out of a spy movie or something.
Yeah, it sounds like it sounds like one of those things that's like just seems inherently unrealistic.
So she gathers her son. Her son is preparing to get into the car where she and her husband are, and somebody confronts her son. And so she goes out and she stabs the person confronting her son with this 16-inch knife. The guy falls to the ground. She apparently stabs him again.
Oh my goodness.
She doesn't show any remorse for this crime. And she is charged and convicted with third-degree murder, as mentioned. And the prosecution just asked for a standard sentence of about 20 years, but she is sentenced by the judge to the absolute maximum sentence of 20 to 40 years, presumably because she did not show the least bit of remorse.
I think that's totally justified. I think sometimes society throughout history has had the tendency to sort of like look at female perpetrators differently than male perpetrators. And there's often been kind of like, oh, well, they're just a lady or whatever. And I think if it doesn't matter who you are or how old you are necessarily, unless we're talking about very young perpetrators, obviously. If you're doing something and then like, you know, as brutal as this and then not showing any remorse. Also, it doesn't even sound like her son was actively in danger during this confrontation. It's not like someone was approaching him with a gun or something.
And I should mention the name of the victim. The name of the victim is Michael Sides.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's
She did not try to help him afterwards, did not call 911. The prosecutor in the case, this is an upsetting quote. Afterwards, when he was lying on the ground, gasping for air, bleeding out, she stood over him, posturing, and took another swing at him.
Jeez. I think most of us can understand the impulse of a parent to try to help their child and defend their child. And so, to me, you know, getting involved there, maybe we can understand that, but it escalates to a point where it's not really as understandable anymore.
And why bring a 16-inch knife? Why even have this 16-inch?
Well, I mean, if you're an older lady, maybe you want to protect yourself, but it should be used for protection, not like basically gutting people in bar fights.
Yeah, there's always an interesting line to be drawn between where does self-defense end and murder begin.
If you are not actively in danger, I don't think you can claim self-defense. And also, I think if you've made no efforts to secure help or deal with the situation otherwise, you know, you can't. And actually, that kind of does touch upon a case we're going to be talking about in a moment. But first, anything else for this one?
Again, the fact that the judge on his own chose to give out the harshest possible sentence, I think tells you at least the judge doesn't see any ambiguity in here about where self-defense ends and murder begins. And for a 70-year-old woman getting a sentence like this, let's be blunt, she is not going to have another free day in her life. She's going to die in a cell.
Right. Definitely. So speaking of sort of dubious self-defense claims from an elderly perpetrator, we got one recommendation from one of our awesome listeners about a case that is just incredibly depressing from Ohio. This happened in South Charleston, Ohio. And it involves, it's gotten a lot of media coverage. My sources were CNN, CBS, WBNS 10 TV, the Galleon Inquirer, and the Midland Daily News. This is an incident that occurred on March 25th, 2024. An 81-year-old man named William Brock got some calls, and they were disturbing. A male caller was telling him his nephew was in jail and that he needed to wire over money for bond. And Brock said no, and then the male caller started threatening him and his family. So there's some sort of extortion scam going on. We're going to talk about this in a minute, but these are becoming increasingly pervasive, and they often target elderly individuals. Maybe you even know someone who's gone through this. Unfortunately, most of them have bad endings, but most of them don't have quite as bad an ending as this one. So meanwhile, a 61-year-old woman named Lo-Letha Hall, who is an Uber driver, she had an account request that she pick up a package from Brock's house. So Miss Hall was known as Letha by her family and friends. She grew up in Columbus, although she moved to North Carolina for a time and then back to Columbus relatively recently. She was a tax professional before she retired at the Regional Income Tax Agency. She worked at a variety of places. When she retired, she began to drive for Uber, but you can even see in a 2005 copy of the Galleon Inquirer that she was like helping elderly people with tax stuff. And she just seems to be a very beloved person by her family. She was a devout member of the Faith Ministries Church, a frequent volunteer, went to Ohio State University, was a mother, close with her family, and an avid gardener. So she just sounds like a lovely person. And she was very likely not at all aware of this scam. So police say that they don't believe she was part of the scam. They don't believe she knew anything. She was just an Uber driver responding to a request, doing her job. So she shows up at Mr. Brock's house, and dash cam shows what happens next. So I'll describe it. It's a disturbing watch. I did include a link in our show notes, but just be aware we're watching the last moments of somebody's life, and it's very upsetting to me. Miss Hall apparently arrives and simply asks Mr. Brock about the package. We see her exit her car on the dash cam. We can see like the backdrop of a white garage door, a reindeer decoration in front of it, and then an African-American woman in a blue fleece, jeans. She's holding a white pair of glasses and her phone. She gets out and slowly kind of like limps a little bit around the hood of the car toward the house. Then suddenly we see her backing up very quickly. And she's followed this time by an elderly white man, Mr. Brock. He's also slightly hunched. He's mostly bald and he's wearing a purple plaid shirt. She's retreating. Her body language is very much like not escalating, kind of just like get me out of here. And he is being very aggressive. He is following her. He is pointing the gun right at her. He is getting in her space, getting closer and closer to her. Her expression is just terrified and completely confused. So they disappear out of range of the dash cam. The car shakes. And what police say happened is that he was trying to hold her at gunpoint. She tried to get in her car to just get out of there, and he shot her multiple times. She died at the hospital. He called 911 and basically said, I was in fear for my life. But when police reviewed things, they saw that she was not posing any sort of threat to him. So he was arrested and he's being held on a $200,000 bond. And yeah, I mean, this is just horrifying because Mr. Brock may have been a victim of this scam, but that certainly doesn't justify going around and shooting people who are not posing a threat to you. So it kind of goes back to that, what is self-defense? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it goes to what is self-defense. And even if you believe you are in danger, if you're not actually in danger, that doesn't give you a license to use deadly force.
He has a house there. I mean, he could just stay in the house, take photos of her, take photos of the car. If he believes that she's part of the scam, which it sounds like she definitely was, and she was a victim of this too. But if you're that concerned, there are half measures that you can take to document this, where you're not going out, and it's not the Wild West. You can't just go shoot somebody that you think you might have a grievance with. And CNN reported that Uber has banned the account that asked her to pick up the package. I hope that law enforcement is also investigating the scammer and that they're putting together a case against these people because, again, these scams are life-ruining. And in this case, the result of this scam led to a woman being murdered.
Yeah, I'm struck by how when you commit a criminal act, sometimes the things that ripple out from that act are things you don't expect. Certainly, I would imagine that the person who perpetrated this scam did not intend for it to end with an elderly man killing an innocent woman, but that's what happened. And so, yeah, it's just a tragedy.
Yeah, and again, Mr. Brock is culpable as far as I'm concerned. My sympathy is with him as far as being the victim of a scam, because no one should have to go through that, and it's awful that elderly people are targeted in this way. But my sympathy ends the moment that you decide to take another person's life, specifically the life of an older woman who was not posing a threat, who had no idea what was going on, and who you don't pull a gun on someone. You don't shoot somebody unless they are trying to harm you and attack you. This was not a situation where she was trying to break into his house to get a package. She was just doing her job. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And, people need to understand that, like, your personal fear and anger does not justify cold-blooded murder. That's not what self-defense is.
No.
You have to be actively in danger. And I will say just a couple of the Midland Daily News had a great article that I'm going to include in our show notes. It's just about how we can all protect the elderly people in our lives, because this is something a lot of us might face with our elderly relatives. About how to deal with the scammers, because they can be sophisticated and they really do target the elderly. And it's often this kind of ransom thing where it's like, we have your nephew, or we have your son, or your son is in jail, send us this, or you're going to owe money to the IRS if you don't pay this right now. So first of all, awareness. Talk to people in your life who might be a target about, you should never give over your financial information on the phone. You should never assume that this person on the phone is telling you the truth about some sort of ransom situation. You need to not necessarily just accept that. But then again, people can have memory issues. People can have other issues going on. So Midland Daily News, one great tip that I thought was awesome was, if you can take their cell phone and silence all unknown callers, and then just be diligent about adding things like the doctor, the doctor's numbers, or various people in their lives that should be calling them. That's a great way, because if the scammers can't reach the target, then they can't necessarily harm them directly. And a similar thing can be done for landlines, but I would just encourage people to have those conversations, because I think awareness, when you're in a situation and you're being told something scary, then you might take it too seriously. So conversations, and then maybe some proactive stuff with numbers and changing phone settings so more spam is caught.
Great advice.
Yes. But again, none of that excuses what happened to Miss Hall. And my heart goes out to her family, because she just sounds like a really special person.
No, I'd like to go down to a case in Florida. Sources for this were NBC News and also TC Palm. And when I try to look for cases to discuss on Cheat Sheet, sometimes I have a bias. I always enjoy seeing cold cases that are solved decades later. And generally speaking, when we see those cases, they're solved by DNA. There's some DNA from the crime scene that was preserved, and now we've identified a killer or a perpetrator. But this is kind of more of an old-fashioned story, because this is the story of a cold case from 1968 that was just solved. DNA is not a part of it. It is more like old-fashioned police work by Indian River County Sheriff Eric Flowers and his team. And also there's a part that is played in there by the media.
Love it when the press are heroes.
So let's talk about it. This story is of a murder of a milkman named Hiram Grayam. He was killed back in April of 1968. And if you know your history, I'm sure you might be aware that April of 1968 would be right after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh.
So, a lot of racial tensions in the air at the time. This man is a milkman, as I mentioned. Two men apparently forced their way into his vehicle and made him drive off into the woods. And his body was found there not long afterwards. He's been murdered execution style. And these happen to be two men who are African American. So this really inflames racial tensions at the time. The key witness who saw these two men do this is a little girl who has been promised a birthday cake from the milkman. And she sees this, and the milkman, apparently wanting to spare her, wanting to protect her, kind of shoos her away and says, I'll be back later. I just got to take these people somewhere.
That's really sad.
Well, it's one of the last acts of this milkman's life is basically to protect someone else. So I think that's an act of heroism on his
Absolutely.
part. And I should mention this man was also a World War II veteran. So
he was very decorated, right? Is my understanding.
Yeah, so being a hero wasn't exactly a new thing for him. So the investigation happens. Police say, this isn't a racial thing. It's just a robbery. The crime doesn't get solved. There's talk that maybe the crime scene was compromised or mistakes made. Those of us who listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, read about true crime, we hear these things all the time. And so the case kind of recedes into the background. And then back in, I believe it was 2006, the family of Mr. Grayam, gives some interviews about the case. The case gets a little burst of coverage. We've all seen stories like that. We've done stories like that on the podcast where we try to highlight old cases. And so the case gets a burst of coverage from the media. And so at this point, a man named, I want to make sure I get his name absolutely correct here. A man named Thomas Jefferson Williams writes to the media who is covering the case and says, this murder you're writing about? Well, they said I had something to do with it, but I didn't. So just put that out of your mind. So basically, he's putting himself on the radar of police and media and investigators by preemptively denying involvement in a crime no one had accused him of taking part in. And after that, not long afterwards, he does die. But it has since come out that prior to his death, he had confessed to this murder to two separate people. And these two people who heard these confessions had no contact or connection to one another. The confessions contained all sorts of information that convinced the police it was true. And these people indicated they had held back from sharing the information previously because they were afraid of this man. And it was only the fact that he had died that gave them the courage to come forward. So on the basis of these two confessions, kind of his odd behavior in preemptively writing to the media and saying, I had nothing to do with this, they're declaring the case solved and that he was the shooter. There was still the mystery of the other man, and they do believe they have a lead on that.
I hope that man's alive so somebody gets friggin' arrested. I hate when people sit on information like this until nothing can be done in order to apprehend the perpetrator. I understand being scared, but I think there's something incredibly selfish about that.
I'm just happy that this family has answers. And I am also very happy that this sheriff, I want to keep sharing his name, Sheriff Eric Flowers, is putting resources into looking at these old cases and doing these interviews.
Yeah, bravo to him, because listen, it's hard to work on any cold case, but it's especially hard when there's no DNA component that can just point you towards someone. It's much harder to do these kind of traditional investigations where you're just piecing everything together piece by piece. And I feel like, that oftentimes that prevents any work from being done on some of these cold cases.
Yes, but it didn't stop this man from putting together a team. Again, this is Indian River County Sheriff Eric Flowers. Kudos to him. The hard work of the team he put together has given answers to a family which has sought them for decades.
Can he come up here? Yeah, can he come up here and work on Burger Chef, please? I think that's the kind of police work that's necessary for Burger Chef in particular. That's a case we cover. That's a cold case, and I don't think that there's going to be some sort of DNA Calvary coming with that. I believe that it would be solved through talking to people, interviewing people, looking at the old case files.
That's the way you have to do it. That's old-fashioned police work. DNA is wonderful. It's an incredible tool that is bringing tons of people to justice. But it's not going to solve every case. And this was a case that could not be solved by DNA, but it was solved by the team of Eric Flowers.
So thank you to Eric Flowers, and come to Indiana, please. Well, that's a great case that you found, Kevin. That's an older case. I think the one we're going to talk about next is very recent and also deeply troubling. My sources for this, the Times-Union newspaper, had excellent coverage of this. I will link to an article, but also just check them out. They're a very good newspaper in general. And randomly, I also relied on a article from Anesthesia, a publication of the Association of Anesthetists. Also something from CBS 6 Albany.
And perhaps some general knowledge you have from growing up in the same household as an anesthesiologist.
Yeah, my dad is an anesthesiologist, so shout out to him. And
because as soon as we started talking about this story, you started telling me some details about chloroform that I didn't know.
Yeah, I have never been a scientifically minded person, and certainly have no aptitude for anything that would kind of render me a good physician. But I certainly have picked up some things, and I think the history of anesthesiology in particular is a very fascinating subject. When we see, when you think about it, until relatively recently in history, any sort of like surgery was a disaster because you're having to, knock people out using means that were not so safe. And also more than that, in some cases, not knocking them out at all. So anyways, this gets into something about anesthesia. So a 40-year-old man named Thomas Krider of Ticonderoga, New York. This was a guy who was super passionate and interesting. Kevin, I think he's the kind of guy that we could get along with because he loved some of the things that we really love. So he was a huge Star Trek fan. He worked as a tour guide at a Star Trek sort of related business. You and I both enjoy that franchise very much. And this is more appropriate for your interest, but he was also an Elvis impersonator. So I know you there have been periods in my life where I was a huge Elvis fan. Yeah, I don't think you currently are, but I think at times that would have, so he's very into Elvis as well. He was a huge fan of different properties, and He-Man and She-Ra came up. And friends and loved ones described him as, just kind of a geeky, kind, lovable, and trusting man. One person he trusted was 69-year-old Ronald G. Rayer, and this man was a retired chiropractor. They knew each other for a number of years. So around April 5th, 2024, Krider left to pick up some free furniture in exchange for moving help. It's not super clear what exactly the arrangement was, but apparently Rayer picked up Krider. There was supposed to be some sort of exchange of property. And police say that the two got together at Rayer's Milton, New York home on April 5th, 2024. And they ended up having what police say was a consensual sexual encounter. So that involved Krider being bound and restrained. And again, police say that this was not some sort of attack. This was consensual. And he was then dosed with chloroform multiple times, and apparently that was consensual too. And unfortunately, the situation had some pretty tragic results. But let's talk a little bit about chloroform first, because it's one of those things I think a lot of us have heard of, but may not know a lot about. So chloroform, which is the popular name for trichloromethane, this is a compound. It can serve as a sedative, an anesthetic, a refrigerant, a solvent. In the 19th century, it was widely used as an anesthetic during surgery. So it's supposed to basically render you insensible, knock you out, sedate you.
So surgery can be performed. Exactly. So now you may have heard it not in the terms of medical history, but in fact, if you enjoy mystery or detective or crime novels, chloroform-soaked rags are often used in fiction to produce basically instantaneous unconsciousness in crimes. So you press a chloroform-soaked rag over someone's mouth, they inhale it, they pass out. Okay, that is a myth. That does not that is not how it works. That's not how it works at all. And it's funny, this article for anesthesia by J.P. Payne, a professor of anesthesia, it gets into some of the history of this. And he wrote that as early as in 1865, The Lancet, which is a medical journal, was arguing with people that chloroform was not a good way to knock out someone who doesn't want to be knocked out. Basically, you have to either be already immobilized or incapacitated by being drunk or consenting to really be rendered unconscious through the whole chloroform-soaked rag held over the mouth trick. It's not, you basically have to just not be moving, because it takes 5 minutes for that to work. And you can imagine that is difficult to do that to somebody who doesn't want it done to them. And so this is, again, in The Criminal Use of Chloroform, an article by Professor J.P. Payne, ran in 2002. He discusses a lot of the kind of crime fiction misconceptions about chloroform, so it's very interesting. Here's another thing that detective novels don't tell you. Chloroform is really dangerous. In a detective novel, you're not going to have the protagonist be killed by too much chloroform, because that would be obviously kind of an abrupt and upsetting end. But chloroform is incredibly dangerous. In fact, healthy patients would sometimes die during surgery because they would receive too high of a dose of chloroform. And they tried to mitigate that. But ultimately, chloroform use declined in the 20th century because it's more dangerous than later types of anesthesia that developed. And see, this is what you told me the other day. I had no idea. And then while you're looking up all of these respectable academic sites, I look up Dan Savage, who is kind of a love and sex advice columnist, and he has an article called "Don't Use Chloroform During Sex Because It'll Kill You." Yes.
Well, he's right.
And I'll read you one line he writes. He says, "Knocking someone out with chloroform is not as easy and quick as they made it look on Dukes of Hazzard and Batman and the Hardy Boys and Charlie's Angels and Wonder Woman, all the other classic kink-inducing television programs." So it's very dangerous. It doesn't really work the way you think it's going to work. And if you do happen to have a fantasy where you think it would be fun to have someone be unconscious, maybe your partner can pretend to be unconscious.
Yeah, it's really, really, really dangerous. And as I said, you would hear these cases in the 1800s of otherwise healthy patients dying because they just got too much chloroform. And that was, I mean, obviously 1800s doctors are, I guess, a bit of a different breed than modern day medical practitioners, but still, there's a reason that, nurse anesthetists and anesthesiologists are, specially trained to deal with this, because it can be easy to kill somebody with anesthesia like this, or to get the dose wrong. And you have to be very specially trained in that. And when you have people using it just more casually for sexual encounters because that's their kink, it becomes problematic, because there's a lot of room for error, and the margin of error could be fatal. And unfortunately, in this case, it was fatal for Mr. Krider. He did not survive this encounter. He died. And then Mr. Rayer, instead of doing the right thing, sort of compounded this awful situation. So instead of immediately calling for help, calling 911, explaining what happened, he, for some reason, hid Mr. Krider's body in his basement, moved his stuff around, and that left Mr. Krider's family, friends, to wonder what happened to him. He was reported missing earlier. His wife and friends tried to spread the word, figure out where he was, figure out what happened, because he was supposed to come back. I mean, it wasn't like he was supposed to be gone for a long time. And I mean, that must have been horribly anguishing. And it seems like this guy was just a really beloved figure in his community, his various communities of the different fandoms, and then this area of New York. And I mean, you even see some of the news coverage, and people are commenting below. He went by the stage name TJ Green, and people are just commenting and like, what happened to TJ? This is awful. And it's just very sad, because his death has really impacted a lot of people who cared about him. And a few days after the death, Rayer did go to the Saratoga County Sheriff's Office and did confess. So he said he had Krider's body in his basement. So I'm glad that at least he came forward at that time, but I don't know what the delay was.
At least he did that.
Yeah.
And I would be very curious. My mind goes to strange places. I wonder what those 2 days were like for him, having a dead body in his house. What was going through his mind? What things was he contemplating?
It's always better to just come forward immediately if something like this happens and it's an accident. And listen, chloroform is a highly regulated substance. You're not just supposed to have it. I mean, this is not...
Isn't it? I think in one of the articles I read said you can make it.
Yeah, my understanding is that you can, but I don't...
I would guess that as dangerous as commercial grade chloroform is, homemade chloroform would probably be even still more dangerous.
Well, they are... I don't know exactly how you can make it, or if you can make like a substitute, or what exactly is going on here, but I know investigators from Saratoga are investigating how he got this chloroform. Did he get it from somewhere? Did he, did he produce it? Is someone else producing it and selling it illegally? I don't know, but they need to figure out where he got it from, because this could be dangerous for other people too. And so Krider is not charged with murder, but he is charged with second-degree manslaughter and evidence tampering. So that speaks to me that investigators do not believe that this was purposeful or that he intended to kill Mr. Krider, but they are still holding him accountable for what he did do.
And it also sounds like they believe that this was a consensual encounter.
Yes, that's been very clear from the Times Union's coverage, that there's nothing about like a kidnapping or somebody being lured somewhere and attacked. It seems like what investigators believe at this time is that this was a consensual sexual encounter that unfortunately had a tragic ending. And it does underscore, like, when it comes to substances that can like render someone unconscious or render somebody incapacitated, a dosing is often, the difference between life and death. And if someone gets a dose wrong, then people can die, and it's very, very dangerous. And so it's important to be aware that sometimes somebody can find themselves in real danger, even if it's not someone who intends to do them harm.
Well said. Should we now wrap up by taking a trip to the neighboring state of Kentucky?
Yeah, we're going to go visit our southern neighbor now, I suppose. So this case is wild. I mean, it's just...
What were the sources for it?
My sources were WSMV had an exclusive report. We're going to link to that.
By Jeremy Finley, is that the man's name?
I believe so. And you should all check this out. And they've been doing just incredible coverage of this case. So we're not going to get you all the details. You should, if you're interested, read up on their site. That will take care of every curiosity I think you have about this. And I also read the Martin v. Commonwealth 2003 case, which was, I believe, the man at the center of this, his like appellate case. That gave some interesting details. So a man named Christian or Kit Martin had been a major in the United States Army. He was stationed at Fort Campbell in Kentucky. He was living in Pembroke, Kentucky. And he was having some pretty bad problems in his life. He and his wife, his ex-wife, Joan Harmon, they separated. They were getting a divorce. And she accused him of abusing her. And he was also being accused with conduct unbecoming an officer and abuse of a child less than 16 years old. And mishandling classified military documents. Now, where that all comes in is that we have to go back to a situation involving Joan Harmon and a couple named Calvin and Pamela Phillips. Harmon said she wanted to leave Martin and asked her neighbors, the Phillipses, to help her move out of the house, and that she shared with Martin. So during that move, Mr. Phillips is moving stuff around, and he looks over at a desk and sees what seems to be classified military intelligence documents lying on the desk, just out where anyone can view them, which is obviously, my understanding, is not appropriate for documents of that level. And meanwhile, Miss Martin also sends him a picture of one of Martin's children that had apparent injuries that she said were inflicted on this child by the father. So Phillips passes all of that on to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, saying, like, this guy is abusing a child and also has all these classified military documents just lying out. And this essentially ended up going into a court-martial. So Martin was facing court-martial, and Calvin Phillips was going to be a key witness at the court-martial. Meanwhile, the Phillipses started telling people they were very scared of Martin. If anything happened to them, that everyone should look at Martin. The court-martial was continued a number of times, but ultimately, it seemed like it was going to finally happen in December of 2015. On November 18th, 2015, Pamela had not heard from her husband, and she was freaked out because a washing machine had been supposed to be delivered, but she got word that they couldn't deliver it because no one was at home. So she went home early to check on her husband, Calvin. And while she did this, she was on a phone with a friend. That friend said, yeah, I actually tried to call Calvin earlier and I couldn't get a hold of him, so I'm not really sure what's going on. Pamela asked her friend to hold on because she saw something. Then she screams and the line goes dead. The friend hurries over to her house. She finds the door open, but no one's there. At the time, the friend says Pamela's car was parked there normally. She leaves, comes back in about an hour, and the car has been moved. So next morning at 2:15 a.m., a farmer hears gunshots, and then the next day finds a car burning in his field. So the bodies of Pamela Phillips and the Phillips' neighbor, Edward Dansereau, are found in the car, and they have been shot with a .22 caliber weapon. Meanwhile, investigators find the body of Calvin Phillips in his home. He had been killed with a .45 caliber gun. So this is just a horrific triple homicide, obviously. The Phillips' son and his aunt ended up kind of taking control of the house after this horrific case. And the aunt found a shell casing in 2016. It was tested. In 2018, the test revealed it to have been fired from Martin's gun. So the theory became that Phillips was getting ready to testify against Martin, so he wanted to eliminate him as a witness. So he killed him. And then Mrs. Phillips and Mr. Dansereau happened to come back or kind of stumble upon the crime at the wrong time, and they were eliminated too. So ultimately, though, it took a long time for this all to come together. So he was arrested in 2019. At that point, he'd become a pilot for PSA Airlines, which is a subsidiary of American Airlines. He was tried in 2021, and he was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder, and he got life in prison without the possibility of parole. But as WSMV reported, there were a lot of things that just didn't quite, like, why did no one hear the gunshots? Why did the AR-15 that Martin had seemingly not match the AR-15 that had been used to shoot Mrs. Phillips and Mr. Dansereau? Like, what? How do we account for that? And of course, Martin is proclaiming his innocence. Whatever. Well, Kentucky investigators sort of stayed on the case, specifically Lieutenant Scott Smith of the Christian County Sheriff's Department. They kept on monitoring Martin's calls from prison, and in one call, he told his sister very urgently, "Okay, my new house in Raleigh, North Carolina, it's going to be put on the market. I need you to go there and get a box that is hidden under the staircase. And don't worry about what's in it, but go get the box." Well, Kentucky investigators beat them there, and they find a box with a silencer for a gun. So might answer one question about this case, as well as an AR-15-22. Now, unfortunately, that AR-15-22 had been stripped of all the parts that could possibly identify any bullets that would have matched it to the crime scene. But, okay, that's interesting. This doesn't have any real impact on the case because he's already been convicted. But this might silence some, doubts about his guilt, I would imagine.
Using the word silence because there was a silencer?
No, I wasn't. I stumble into puns all the time. But I just think that, yeah. I think he's exactly where he needs to be.
That sounds like the case. I'm curious as to why he held on to those weapons for so long.
Yeah,
I would think if you're a pilot, you probably travel, you probably have chances to get rid of things.
Arrogance, I don't know. It's definitely, this is a really horrific case. Like what the Phillips family went through and what Mr. Dansereau went through is just horrifying. And it was all because they essentially were trying to do the right thing by being honest about what they saw. And this man just sounds like he's been out of control for a while, victimizing his own family, doing things that he shouldn't be in a trusted position with the military. And then instead of taking any sort of accountability for any of that, he takes it out on the people who, just happen to witness his bad behavior. Like the arrogance of that is stunning. And it's just scary that there are people out there. And frankly, the law enforcement and our system has to take these cases incredibly seriously because elimination of witnesses is not just an attack on individuals, it's an attack on the entire system.
That's an excellent point and well said. I'd like to thank people for listening to this cheat sheet. But before we wrap up, I've gotten some very kind messages wishing me well in my recovery. I think at this point, I'm probably maybe 85% back to my usual self. I'm getting there.
You're getting rambunctious again.
I want to publicly thank you for being so helpful during the whole recovery process. And also, it's incredible. When there's something wrong with me, not only does Anya take care of me, but I don't know if it's because of anxiety or worry. She has a lot of energy. So she's going around cleaning up the house. She's doing a lot of extra stuff. So she's really been putting herself through the ringer. And I want to thank you for that.
Well, you're really sweet. And when you're not around to goof around with me, then I'm just going to be putting all my pent up energy into everything else. So I'm excited that you're feeling so much better.
She's publicly accusing me of keeping her from housework.
No, well, I'm just glad you're feeling better because I think you're the best. So I love you.
Well, I love you too, and we also love our audience.
Yeah,
So
we love you
Thank you
guys.
all for listening.
Thank you for listening. We just appreciate all of you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.